option expensing under ASC Topic 718, Variables, Expensing, and Disclosures Explained. Just a few administrative items before we get started, and then we'll get our program underway. My name is Becky Blackler. I am the Director of Marketing with Corporate Focus. Just a few tips on using GoToWebinar. All attendee lines are muted for the duration of the presentation. We are going to take questions throughout the event that we'll answer during our Q&A period at the end of the program. So if you have questions, you can submit it in one of two ways. You can either enter them in the questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, or you can also ask them in the chat window. If you have any technical issues, just simply raise your hand, which you can also do through your GoToWebinar module. It is the little icon that looks like a hand with a green arrow raised. I am happy to introduce today's speaker, Jeremy Wright, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Corporate Focus. He is in charge of our product development as well as our customer support and our operations. Jeremy is a recognized expert on equity administration best practices, equity compensation accounting, and leveraging next-generation stock plan reporting tools, as well as a frequent speaker at industry events, such as Aspirations, the National Center for Employee Ownership, the Global Equity Organization, as well as law firms and bar associations. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Becky, for that great introduction, and I look forward to speaking to everybody today on Topic 718 and option expensing. So to get us started, when you signed up, everyone was sent a survey and some questions to get your feedback on option expensing and how that relates to you. So, the first question we asked was, which part of option expensing is the most challenging to you? And even though FAS 123R, now Topic 718, has been around since 2006, we did hear very similar comments from people. As we can see here, 42% of respondents to our survey said the biggest challenge is simply generating fair value using the Black-Scholes formula, with the second biggest challenge being determining one of the inputs to the Black-Scholes formula, which happens to be volatility. We did get some feedback on just being able to simply run disclosures as well as calculate an expected term, and 20% of people simply said it all seems like rocket science to me. So based on those answers as well as feedback that we got in terms of some of the text fields that you filled in, people said, well, I need to know the basics of 718 and how to get started. Our company has never booked 123R expense and is undergoing the first audit, as well as, I maintain complicated spreadsheets to capture option expense. So, to me, this shows us that people still need to know the basics of Topic 718 and what makes up the process to calculate this information. Now, luckily, even if you think this is rocket science, you can still get a decent understanding of Topic 718 so that you can use available software to make the process really easy so it all gets done in a timely manner and you can answer the questions that your auditors give you. Which leads us to the second question. On a scale of 1 to 5, we asked, well, rate the level of scrutiny your auditors provided during their annual review of your equity compensation report, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. But also, if you've never done a Topic 718 audit, hit 0. So actually 34% of people have not yet done a 718 audit. So it's no wonder that between running a business and having a personal life, you haven't delved into all the details and just a general understanding of all things 718. Now, for those of you who have done an audit, respondents, 42%, had a pretty high level of scrutiny from their auditors. So during this presentation, I hope to show you how next year's audit can be a little less tough. So the next two questions relate to just general tracking and how much scrutiny are people doing on your cap tables and those kind of things. We do provide the answers to this for reference for you, but in order to get into the meat of the information, I just want to skip down into this question, which was the last question we asked, which is, what process or system do you currently have in place for your equity administration, accounting, and compliance? Not too surprisingly, 68% of respondents are still using spreadsheets for their accounting and tracking. And honestly, my guess is that for the 42% of people who said their auditors gave them a really hard time on the audit, probably fall into the spreadsheet category as well, because when auditors see a spreadsheet to do Topic 718 reporting, they're going to go through the formulas and the cells with a fine-tooth comb because every spreadsheet is going to be a little bit different in terms of doing this entire process. Now, 26% of respondents are using an existing equity reporting system, which again is not too surprising that there was about 24% of respondents that had a 1 to 3 level of scrutiny with their audit. So those numbers are kind of tied together, and when you use a system to do this type of tracking, then all the formulas and things are typically documented, and everything we go through is really spelled out and standardized. So now that we've seen the survey and know that we are going to focus a little bit on the basics of Topic 718 today, what will we accomplish today? So again, today's webinar is intended to help CFOs, controllers, consultants, outside attorneys to understand Topic 718, understand the puzzle. Again, primarily focused on privately held venture-backed companies. And so what we're going to learn today are the 6 variables used by the Black-Scholes formula to determine the grant date fair value. We're going to cover how you take that fair value that's calculated using those variables and amortize the expense. And then finally, we'll cover and show kind of 2 standard reports that you can cover, that you will provide to your auditors to report the necessary disclosures. So what's involved in this process? And to me, it really boils down to 8, and I won't say simple steps, but they are 8 steps to actually do this process, and something that you have to do for each one of your option grants, and typically have to do it on an ongoing basis. The first step is to determine the variables that will go into the Black-Scholes calculation. Once we have those variables, we want to generate fair value per share for each option grant. Okay, that's going to give us a total fair value, which is fair value per share times number granted. As soon as we have the total fair value, we will amortize that expense over the option service period, which again is typically the vesting schedule. The 5th step is to take a forfeiture rate and apply it to that amortization schedule to generate the projected fair value. By doing this, we haircut the expense due to the expectation of employee terminations and their forfeited options. Expense is then trued up for actual vesting and forfeiture events at each reporting period. When an option fully vests, the company will have taken the full total value of each option grant within their system. And then at each reporting period, you will provide disclosures to your auditors on all the information that went into these calculations. Not too much rocket science there so far. So the first step is to get the Black-Scholes variables, and there's actually 6 variables that go into the Black-Scholes calculation. The first 2 are fair market value and exercise price. So, as a private company, you're typically setting your underlying stock value using a 409A valuation, and that number is what's used for your exercise price and for the date grant fair market value. The next 3 inputs are expected term, interest rate, and volatility. So we're going to go through those in a little bit more detail on the next 3 slides. And the final variable is dividend rate. Again, for the majority of private companies are not giving out dividends. So when you go to do a Black-Scholes calculation, the dividend rate will be 0. So expected term. And we cover expected term first because that actually drives our volatility in our interest rate. Now, again, for the majority of private companies, your option plans are going to be relatively new, a few years old, so you're not going to have a lot of history, exercise, and cancellation behavior to model an expected term using one of the more complicated methods that are out there. So the majority of private companies still use the simplified method. And the simplified method was first discussed under FAS 123R in SAB 107. At the time, it was a safe harbor method. It was then extended by SAB 110. And again, within SAB 110, it says that you can use this method if you don't have enough history in the past. And again, the majority of private companies still do this because it really boils down to just a simple formula. And the formula is contract term plus your weighted average vesting divided by 2. Contract term is really easy, right? So that's just your options life. More likely than not, it's going to be 10 years. The weighted average vesting, we'll look at your vesting schedule for the option grant, and then between the date of grant and each vesting date, we will take the number of days from the grant date to the vest date. So we can see here 366, 458, and so on. We take that number at each vesting tranche, multiply that by the shares vested to come up with the weighted average number. Those numbers are all totaled up, and then we divide by the total option grant, in this case, which is 1,000. That's going to give us kind of a weighted average number. But again, this is a yearly value that we're looking at. So we want to take that divided by 1,000, by 365, or the number of days in a year, to give us the yearly equivalent weighted average of 1.38. So we take that, 10 plus 1.38, divide by 2, which gives us an expected term of 5.69. So when you go to justify the expected term to the auditors, it's really useful to have an example of that formula for a few of the option grants so they can see exactly what you did, and also just having an explanation of not having enough historical data to justify the use of this simplified method. The next variable is interest rate. So interest rate, you can actually go to the Federal Reserve site, and there's a link in the slide, and download the Treasury constant maturities. Once you have that information, it's going to be downloaded in 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 10-year increments. And once you have that, if your expected term happens to match one of those years, you can just use that amount. So if it's 5, you just use the value that you downloaded from the Federal Reserve. Again, most times your expected term is not going to be an even number. Ours, it was 5.69. So what we tend to do is round that up to the nearest 0.25 increment, in this case 5.75, and all you need to do is average the rates. So you average 5 and 7 to get a 6, average it again, and you get the rate that you should use for this variable. Now, if you do a lot of Google searching and trying to read up on interest rate, you will hear about zero coupon rates, which is another rate that you can use. So that information is not publicly available, and so interest rates, most auditors actually will accept this information in place of a zero coupon number. So in terms of auditor justifications, again, just explain the use of Treasury constants, give them the download that you got from the Federal Reserve, as well as if your expected term is 5.75, just an example of your averages calculation. So volatility is the next variable that goes into the Black-Scholes calculation. And, as a private company, in order to get your volatility, you're obviously not traded. So how do we do that? So the way that you do that is you have to determine comparable companies that are in effect traded on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange or some other trading market. So once you've determined those companies, you then have to calculate your volatility. And this is a volatility spreadsheet exported out of our system Corporate Focus to show how the system calculates volatility. The purpose of this from Corporate Focus's perspective is so that a client can send this file to an auditor so they can see exactly how the calculation is being done. For our purposes today, we can actually use it to see how volatility is calculated using our peer companies. Now, if you were or are doing this yourself on spreadsheets, obviously you'd have to create this from the ground up. Now, once you have your comparable companies, what you do is for each one of those peers, you would download their historical closing prices from Yahoo Finance. It's a great place just to put in the stock symbol and get as much history as you can for each of those peers. And here we have, so we can see the daily closing prices for the 3 peers that I'm using, and what the difference in the return is from day in to day out over each trading day. So once we have those closing prices, we then take the standard deviation of that information over the number of trading days in each trading period. So we want to look at this on an annual basis. We can see I've set mine up to show from 98 to 2007 to get the annual volatility within each one of those years. Now, once we have that information, the actual volatility you will use for each one of those peers is based on the expected term. As we did with the interest rate, 5.69, it's easier just to round it up to, in this case, 5.75. We'd go and use those rates to come up with the volatility rate that matches a 5.75 expected term. We have that for each one of our peers, and once we have that information, we can take either an average of those 3 amounts, just a simple average. You can take a median, or the method we typically recommend is just to weight it based on increments, that add up to 100, so that if you have some of your comparables who are less similar to you and some that are more similar to you, you can rate those that are more similar to you higher than those that are less. And once we have that number, that gives us the volatility to use within our Black-Scholes formula. Now, again, all those variables as you're doing it, you actually are doing those on a grant-by-grant basis, because those grants typically will probably have different dates of grants, different vesting schedules. So if you have 50 grants, assume a portion of those are probably spread out over a few days. You probably will have to do this calculation multiple times to get the appropriate variables to use for each one of the option grants. So once you have your inputs, you plug it into the Black-Scholes calculator, and again, if you do a Google search or you're using a system, you can easily find numerous Black-Scholes calculators out there that you just plug the information in that you have, and that comes out with the fair value per share. Using a $4 fair market value, 5.69 expected term, 40% volatility, and a 2.5% interest rate, your fair value per share will be $1.65. So before we get into how we expense that fair value, just one note on a difference between employees versus non-employees. So there is a difference in terms of how you set the fair value for employees and non-employees. Employees are your run-of-the-mill employees. They're your officers. They typically are also your board members or your directors. And when you're doing fair value for employees, that's all done under ASC 718, previously 123R. And that does grant date valuation. So we just set the fair value per share based on the date of grant. And that never changes. I mean, there are some exceptions when you do a modification and those types of things, but you just value it once and you're all set. You just have to worry about expensing that fair value. For non-employees, namely consultants who you might hire, that's done under ASC 50550, which was previously 96-18, and that does vest date valuation. So the fair value is ultimately set on each individual vesting date based on the inputs calculated as of that vest date. So you're going to set it once, but you're going to end up setting it multiple times. So, expensing options. The general principle in terms of being able to expense an option is that at any point in time, you must expense as much as has theoretically vested. So if you're 30 days into a vesting tranche, you do have to have expensed 30 days of expense. You can't just wait until the option vests in order to do the expense. This is an ongoing process. So what goes into doing that? Well, we've already seen how to do the fair value per share by using the Black-Scholes method. Once we have that, the next thing you need to know is the actual fair value. So the actual fair value is the value of the entire grant, assuming the option does not forfeit. So that's just number granted times fair value per share. The requisite service period is a time period the optionee will provide services in exchange for the fair value. Again, for plain vanilla options, this is going to be your vesting schedule, and assuming a 4-year vest, your requisite service period is 4 years. You then have a forfeiture rate, which is used to determine the projected fair value, and we'll go over this in a little bit more detail in a future slide. You then have expensing methods, which is a elected method used to spread the actual fair value over the requisite service period. You get the projected fair value, which is a sum of the amortization schedule, which will actually be less than the actual fair value due to the forfeiture rate haircut. You have the reporting period, which is the period that you have to report the expense to your auditor. And then at each reporting period, true-up will probably be done that will adjust the amortization schedule for actual vesting and forfeiture events. So the forfeiture rate is kind of one of the key things that go into generating an amortization schedule. And in terms of determining the forfeiture rate, if you do have enough historical data, this rate can be calculated based on the percentage of shares forfeited against grants in each previous year across all of your option grants. Now, most systems have a forfeiture rate report that can pull this data for you. And you can use this to either come up with the forfeiture rate to go forward or to make sure that you're in line with your forfeiture rate. Now, the forfeiture rate, again, as a private company, you might not have enough historical data to come up with this. So again, you can look at either comparable companies to come up with a rate. You can look over your turnover rate. There are different methods that you can come up with to figure out the rate to use across your grants. So the forfeiture you select is important and will definitely be scrutinized by your auditor, since the higher the rate, the more expense you're pushing into the future. You also typically don't want to pick 0, otherwise you're taking more expense up front than you probably need to. It's important to remember that you're guessing here, in quotes, on how many of your option holders will leave the company through each one of the option service periods. And since we definitely don't expect 0 people to leave and aren't hoping for a mass exodus, you should definitely try to pick a reasonable rate. This will come back into play when we talk about the true-up. For our clients, we typically see rates of somewhere between 2.5% and 25% on average. So here we can see there's kind of 2 ways that a forfeiture rate can be calculated or used across our vesting schedule. The first is simply a flat rate. And what this does is takes the forfeiture rate one time. You can see if you have 1,000 options, you take 10% of that, which is going to give you 900. That's really a brute force method and is not going to take enough off. And so that's why there's a little thumbs down here versus a thumbs up, which is to use a compounded rate over time that also uses a dynamic forfeiture rate at each reporting period. And what that is basically 1 minus the forfeiture rate to your service period. And the service period is calculated as a number of days between grant date and vest date. Okay, so let's see an example of that. So an annualized rate example, here we have a vesting schedule with a data grant of March 31st, 2009 with 4 separate vesting events at each year. That vest 250 shares each year. So again, the days to vest is determined as 365, 730, and so on, which gives us 4 service periods. By using an annualized rate, we expect for the first vesting tranche to have 90% of that vesting event to stick around. The second one, we expect to have 81%, and so on, which instead of us expecting 900 shares to vest, we expect 773.68, which is probably a lot more accurate in terms of what's actually going to happen. So once you have your expected to vest determined, you then have to apply an expensing method to it across, again, all of your option grants. And you're going to pick one expensing method to use, and it generally falls into 2 different types of classifications. There's a straight line method, and then there's a FIN 28 or accelerated method. You can see here I have straight line as well as something called abbreviated as MSL, which means modified straight line. And what a simple straight line does is it just takes a number of days between the grant date and the final vest date, and it uses that number and divides the projected fair value by that number of days to get you one daily expense number. Okay, and so then in each reporting period, you're going to take that amount and determine how much expense to take within each reporting period. So using a straight line method, in our example, we're going to expense about $242 in the first period, and so on. And we can see here, in terms of our option expensing methods compared, we get just a really simple straight line that goes from up to the final vesting event that expenses everything evenly based on that daily expense number. Now, the problem with just a straight line method is that in many cases, you're not going to end up expensing as much as has vested. So the method we recommend is a refined version of the straight line. It's still a straight line method, but it's called the modified straight line, which actually looks at each individual vesting event and vesting tranche to determine that same daily expense, but look at it across each separate vesting tranche. So if you have 4 vesting events, you're going to actually have a daily expense that's calculated in a very similar manner from the data grant to the vest date, and that rate is going to be used, or that amount, to calculate your expense. Using ours, we can see there's actually a little curve to our blue line, because what we've done is we've just kind of taken a little bit more expense in future periods versus later periods. And again, by doing that, all we're trying to do is make sure that at each vesting period, we've taken the amount of expense we needed to take. The final method, or the FIN 28, is an accelerated method. And what that does is that takes expense from each separate vesting tranche and brings it into the period you're currently reporting for. So you'll see when you use that method a huge amount of expense being taken on early on and a lesser amount of expense being taken on further on down the road. So again, in most cases, the FIN 28 is way too much. I don't know about you, but I definitely don't like to to report more than I need to until I have to. And so, a straight line method is definitely the way to go, even though for FIN 28, if you have some performance grants or something along those lines, sometimes that method is recommended. But for the majority of grants to private companies, a straight line method, namely the modified straight line, is the way to go. Now you can see no matter which method we pick, at the end of our vesting, we are going to have expensed the same amount. So this is really about how it gets split up across each of our reporting periods to make sure we're doing it as accurately as possible. Which brings me to the true up. Again, this is a number and a value that you end up doing every single year or every single quarter. And so when you do a true up, you're in essence affecting that expense that we estimated at the beginning, so that you take a credit for any expense taken for options forfeited during the period. Okay, because again, we're estimating this amount, our forfeiture rate's an estimate, and so there's a good chance that no matter what forfeiture rate you pick, that you're going to kind of preload some of the expense before those options are really vested. So when that happens, and the employee leaves and those options are forfeited, you get a credit for anything that you've expensed previously. And that's definitely good news. We all like credits. We all like seeing those types of information happen on our reports. You also, though, get a debit entry for any employees still with the company. So these options, we talked about a dynamic forfeiture rate and the shares expected to vest. These options are now more likely to vest at this point. Okay, so here this is the same table that we saw earlier, but it's reporting after the first reporting period and after the first vesting event has actually vested. So when that's happened, our service period for that first vesting tranche is now completed. So we are on the hook for that 100% of that vesting period. No matter what else happens, if the employee never exercises the options, you are on the hook to expense for 250 options. Okay. The other thing that's happened is we've now are now more likely to vest in the future periods, the next 3 vesting tranches. So everything is now, is now more likely to vest, which basically sums up from 773 up to about 859 at this point. So I'm sure everyone who's on the line, everyone's still awake and hasn't fallen asleep yet on all this. And we've now seen how to calculate and determine the variables to go into Black-Scholes, as well as how to determine an expensing schedule. So once you've done all that work, you now have to disclose your information. And there's really 2 things, or 2 general areas that you need to disclose. The first is your actual expense number. So this is an expense recognition report that shows me the type of information that you need to give to your auditors to report all that information. Okay, and so not only do you have to give individual details on each separate option grant for things such as the number granted, fair value per share, how many options have vested to date, as well as what's the actual fair value of those vested options, but you need to report the actual expense, right? So this breaks down into a few areas. The first is called the projected fair value. So this is the amount that we estimated, or our projected fair value across the entire service period. Okay. We then have to expense or report the expense reported prior to the period that we're reporting on. Okay, so how much expense have we taken to date? You then estimate, you had previously estimated the projected expense to take for the current reporting period. So that's the next column. Again, you probably are doing a true up, and you're going to have debit entries and credits. So you need to do a true up for the period, and you need to report that number. you then actually get to, well, how much am I reporting? What compensation expense do I actually have to take for this period? And that's really your projected expense for the period plus your true up. Then you have the total reported expense up through the date that you're reporting for, and your unrecognized compensation or your remaining expense. So you need to provide all these numbers to your auditors as part of the Topic 718 process. So not only do you need to disclose the actual expense information, but you also need to disclose separate fields and separate information relating to the grants that actually were granted or are still outstanding that went into that expense. And this breaks down into three general sections. The first is what we call the valuation summary. So for all the grants granted within your current reporting period, you need to disclose the Black-Scholes variables and the fair value per share. And you need to do that as a range as well as a weighted average. So a range is just what's the minimum, say, volatility, and what's the maximum volatility for all the grants within the current reporting period. It's not for all of the grants forever. It's just you just want to do the ones that you actually granted during the year. And weighted average is just taking the volatility against the number granted, and again, doing a very similar weighted average formula to come up with your weighted average volatility, risk-free interest rate, expected term, dividend rate, and of course, the fair value per share on grant date. So the second section is the option activity. So across all of the grants that you have, you do have to report, well, what was the prior options outstanding at the beginning of the period? Then during the year, how many grants were granted? How many options were exercised? How many options were canceled pre-vest or that were forfeited? As well as how many options were expired or were canceled post-vest. And for your cancellations, it is really important to differentiate between forfeitures and expirations. So again, forfeitures are pre-vest cancellations, expirations are post-vest cancellations. And not only do you need to disclose the number total for those, but again, you also have to disclose the weighted average exercise price across all that information. So then using that information, you then say, well, what is the total options outstanding at the end of the period? What is the total exercisable at the end of the period? What is the total unvested that can still be exercised at the end of the period? As well as what is the total vested or expected to vest at the end of the period? And the vested or expected to vest, that's one that a lot of people know what options outstanding, exercisable, unvested is. Vested or expected to vest, just going back up here, is actually the amount exercisable, which in this case would be $250, plus the amount that you expect to vest going forward, which is the amount that is calculated after applying a forfeiture rate. So for this option, my vested or expected to vest is my 859 number. And of course, that's done across all of the option grants. So you give the total for that. You give the weighted average exercise price. You also give the weighted average remaining contract term. And again, as a private company, one other disclosure you might be asked for, it's not always required, is the aggregate intrinsic value. So, what's the difference between your current fair market value and the date of grant fair market value for each one of the options? Again, as a private company, that number is not fluctuating too often, but you might be asked for it. And then you have to give the unrecognized compensation amount as well as the weighted average period to recognize that unrecognized compensation. So again, because we're providing these spreadsheets to everybody, we have put together a nice little checklist slide for you all that you not only have to kind of decipher it from the report, but it actually breaks down each section so that you can, when you're doing your reports, you can make sure you disclose each one of those items. So now that you hopefully have kind of got over the rocket science of topic 718, not that it isn't rocket science, but that you can have a more basic understanding than what you had at the beginning of today's webinar, what are your next steps? How do you move forward from here? Well, the first thing I always tell people is to get organized as soon as possible. No matter if you've had an option plan that's been around 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or if you're just getting started, if you're tracking this in multiple places in an Excel spreadsheet, it's important to not only get your data set, but also all of your backup details, your documents, your, the option agreements. Just make sure you know where all that information is and that it's accessible to you, because that is going to play a huge part of when you do get audited. As part of getting organized, again, it's important to talk to the stakeholders involved in your stock and option tracking. That includes the CFO, the controller, HR, your outside law firm. Again, many private companies might be having this information tracked by the law firm in one spreadsheet or in one system, and they're tracking another system. And so when you have this information all over the place, and say an employee forfeits or terminates, well, it might get reflected correctly in one place, but not in all. So when you go to kind of do your expense, you really want to know about that forfeiture because you really want to get him off the books going forward. So it's really important that everyone is working together, everyone's on the same page, and it really goes into the getting organized piece. Of course, these slides and an archived version of this webinar will be available, and you will receive emails with a link to these presentation materials, as well as an invitation to tomorrow's public demo on corporate focus shortly. And, for those, I've spent the last 30 minutes showing you, 30 plus minutes, showing you the complexity of option expensing. Again, even though it's not rocket science, it's definitely complicated, and, it's going to take time away from your day-to-day business work. There's no way to cut it. Even if it's during the audit period, it's going to take a lot of time away. But if you're kind of keeping organized, doing this on an ongoing basis, it's going to make that audit process a lot easier. So we've explained it in 30 minutes, and let me just show you in 2 minutes how easy it is to run those same 2 expense reports that our clients give their auditors as part of their audit process. So this is corporate focus, and if I want to run an expense recognition and evaluation disclosure report across all of my grants, it's going to take me a lot less time than it did explaining everything in today's seminar. All I do is go to the report and select expense recognition, select the time period that I want to run my information for, and I'll just do 2010, and click preview. And that quickly, we've run a report across all of our option grants to calculate the amount to report to each one to our auditors. And of course, this report can be exported out to Excel or PDF. And if I go back to reports, to run the valuation disclosure is a much similar process. I just select the disclosure. I select the dates. And again, when you're doing your audit, it's very important to provide as much backup detail as possible. And so Corporate Focus will do that for you as well. And that quickly, I was able to generate 2 reports that I can just hand off to my auditors as part of my annual audit process. So, now that you've seen just a quick look at Corporate Focus, you can definitely watch a public demo of Corporate Focus. The next one is tomorrow, or you can see Corporate Focus in action. There's a series of a few very short videos on our website at corporatefocus.com/product tour. And the most important piece of advice I can give is don't wait. Again, the sooner you get started on this, the sooner you start eliminating errors, omissions, which will definitely save time when it comes to audit. When you have that auditor breathing down your neck and you're like, how do I get all this done? If you put these things in place early on and you were prepared, it just makes that process a whole lot easier. So with that, let's turn it over to questions.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm sure you need to take a deep breath
Yeah.
after all of that information share. I know I do. You know, so, we have received a lot of great questions, and we have just a couple minutes for just a few. So just to get us started, could you again review how to calculate the fair value of the stock for one of the inputs for determining the fair value of the option?
Okay. Yeah, I believe that question is reviewing is about the fair market value for the stock or the underlying stock price. And typically to get that, you do a 409A valuation to get the fair market value. That's another complicated process in line with all of this. And we actually just recently did a webinar with some 409 experts that go over that in a lot more detail, and I'm sure we have the name of this individual that we can also provide a link to that webinar as well.
Okay, great. Another question that we received was, if an employee terminates and forfeits after being fully vested, is there any credit?
So, and that's why it's important to determine the expirations versus forfeiture. So when an employee terminates and those options are canceled after they vest, they're actually classified as an expiration. And once an option fully vest, you are on the hook for the expense. So you do not receive a credit for those shares. You only receive a credit for shares that are canceled pre-vest or before those options actually vest.
Okay, wonderful. And regarding vesting periods in general, what if the shares become vested on a certain day instead of over a period of time?
For that one, most options, again, I'd have to get a little more information from the individual in terms of what they do, because options typically vest on a certain day, right, in terms of versus performance grants. So I'm not sure if they're asking about performance grants or just, again, time-based vesting that happens, again, on a certain day. It can be 4 years from now, 3 years from now, or so on. If it is performance grants, that again is a really complicated process, and that expense is done over a service period that you have to define. So there's many different performance criterias, and based on what the actual performance condition is, affects how you define the service period. But the service period is definitely not just that date.
Okay. Okay, great. We have time for just a few more. A really interesting question. Would Board of Directors options be considered as employees under ASC 17 or as non-employees under ASC 50550?
They are typically considered as employees under 718. Okay. Again, with any of this, it's always good to double check with your auditors because there are some exceptions, but typically they are considered employees. Okay,
great. And then one more question, and this is more of a I see. If there is a one-year cliff for vesting, you shouldn't start expensing the option expense until after the first year, should you?
No, you have to start expensing right away. Even when there is an expense, or even when there is like a cliff event, expensing starts right from the date of grant. So once an option is granted, your expense does start. Again, you're not completely on the hook until that vesting event happens. So if the employee forfeits during the year or before the cliff happens, you're going to you're going to get a credit back for that, but you do need to report that person.
Okay, great. Great. Well, just to respect everybody's time, I think that's all the time that we have for today. For the folks that did ask questions, if we did not get to your questions, we'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards to make sure that you get the answers that you need. And also a reminder that we are going to send out a slide deck of today's presentation, as well as an archived version of today's webinar. So, Jeremy, any closing thoughts before we go?
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone again for taking the time to attend today's webinar. I hope you were able to get one or two nice nuggets out of today, whether or not you're brand new to this or someone who's a seasoned veteran, and we're definitely able to get something out of it on a nice hot summer day.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, everyone, so much for attending, and cheers, and hopefully stay cool in this hot summer weather.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Becky.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.